Sign it now, Daniel Whitmore said, sliding the pen across the polished glass table, his voice calm but edged with impatience, the kind that filled rooms before anyone dared to breathe too loudly. And for a moment no one moved, not the row of executives in tailored suits, not the legal team with tablets glowing faint blue in their hands, not even the assistant standing near the wall pretending to disappear, because the number on the screen behind him, $500,000,000, hung there like a weight, pressing on every chest in the room. 5 minutes left on the countdown clock blinking in red, each second ticking louder than it should, like a metronome no one could silence. And then a voice, soft, almost misplaced in a room built on authority, cut through it all. If you sign that, you lose everything in 30 days. And just like that, the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's fingers pausing mid-reach above the pen, as if something invisible had caught his wrist, eyes narrowing not in anger yet, but in confusion, in calculation, because that voice didn't belong here. Not in a boardroom 40 floors above the city where decisions rewrote markets. And slowly, almost reluctantly, heads began to turn, one by one, like dominoes falling in silence, until every gaze landed on her, standing near the far edge of the room where the light didn't fully reach. A young black girl in a maintenance badge that still caught the reflection of the overhead LEDs, her posture straight, not defiant, not apologetic, just still, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. And for a second no one spoke, the hum of the air conditioning filling the gap, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights stretching longer than it should, until someone let out a quiet scoff. Another leaned back in his chair with a half-smile that didn't quite hide the disbelief. And Daniel finally turned his body toward her, slow, deliberate, his presence shifting the room back into orbit around him. "Excuse me?" he said, not loud, not harsh, but precise, the kind of tone that expected correction, expected reality to snap back into place. But she didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes, didn't rush to explain herself the way people usually did when they realized they'd crossed a line they weren't supposed to see. Instead, she took a small breath, the kind you take when you've already made the decision and there's no undoing it, and repeated, clearer this time. The clause on page 14, it transfers all post-merger liability to your firm. And somewhere behind Daniel, a chair creaked, someone shifting uncomfortably, another executive glancing down at his tablet, fingers hesitating before scrolling, because now, there was something else in the room, something heavier than doubt, something that didn't belong to hierarchy or title, and Daniel's expression didn't change, not yet, but his hand, still hovering above the pen, lowered just an inch, enough for those closest to him to notice, enough for the silence to deepen, enough for the ticking clock to feel sharper against the glass walls surrounding them. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one was looking at the deal anymore. They were looking at her. Her name was Maya Carter, and in a building where most people never learn the names of those who cleaned their offices, she had grown used to being invisible, the kind of presence that moved quietly between glass walls and polished floors, leaving everything spotless and unnoticed. Except tonight, she stood under the same lights as the executives, her reflection faintly caught in the table's surface, her maintenance badge resting against her chest like a label that explained everything before. She even spoke, and yet her eyes did not match that label, steady, focused, carrying something that did not belong to routine work or quiet compliance. And Daniel noticed that before he noticed anything else, the way she held herself without shrinking, without asking permission, and it unsettled him more than her words, because people who did not belong here usually showed it, in their voice, in their posture, in the way they hesitated. But she did not, and that small difference lingered in the silence as one of the attorneys finally cleared his throat, leaning forward with a polite smile that barely covered the irritation underneath, asking her where exactly she thought she saw this so-called issue, his tone light but dismissive, as if he was humoring a mistake that would correct itself in seconds. And Maya did not rush. She did not glance around for approval. She simply pointed toward the digital copy on the screen, her fingers steady. "Section C, subsection 3, she said, her voice even. "The language looks protective, but it shifts full legal responsibility after the merger closes." And a few heads tilted, a few brows furrowed, not in agreement yet, but in recognition that she was not guessing, and Daniel's gaze sharpened, his attention narrowing like a lens focusing. Because now this was no longer an interruption. It was a variable, something unexpected entering a system that was supposed to be controlled. And he did not like variables, not when $500 million was on the table and the clock was still counting down, for minutes now, the red numbers blinking with quiet insistence. And he reached for the document again, not fully committing, just enough to glance at the page she mentioned, his fingers brushing the glass as he scrolled, the room watching him more than her now, waiting for the natural order to restore itself, waiting for him to dismiss this and move on. But he did not dismiss it, not immediately, because the phrasing she mentioned was there, buried in lines of legal language that most people skimmed past, structured carefully, deliberately. And he paused, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the man beside him to lean in and whisper that it was standard wording, nothing unusual, that they had reviewed it already, that there was no need to entertain distractions. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, the pressure of expectation returning, the room leaning toward resolution again. And yet something about the way Maya stood, unmoving, unafraid, stayed with him, like a question that refused to fade. And he looked up once more, meeting her eyes directly this time, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would confirm she was out of place. But he found none, only quiet certainty. And behind her, through the glass walls, the city stretched out in layers of light and motion, indifferent to what was happening 40 floors above, while inside the room, everything seemed to hold still again, suspended between decision and doubt. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome no longer felt inevitable. Daniel Whitmore did not sit back this time. He leaned forward instead, elbows just inches from the glass table. The document expanded in front of him as his eyes moved line by line with a precision that had built his empire, the kind of focus that filtered out noise, filtered out ego, filtered out the room itself. And yet the room did not disappear. It shifted, subtle but undeniable. As the attorneys who had been so certain moments ago began to glance at one another, their confidence no longer anchored but floating, one of them adjusting his tie, another scrolling faster than before, as if speed could rewrite what was already printed there. And the man who had dismissed Maya earlier cleared his throat again, this time without the same ease, explaining that the clause was standard risk allocation language, that these things always looked heavier on one side until adjusted post-signature, that it was procedural, temporary, nothing that would actually expose the company in any meaningful way. And his words filled the air but did not settle, because Daniel had stopped listening to tone and started listening to structure, and structure did not lie, not when you read it carefully enough. And the longer he stared at the text, the more the phrasing revealed its shape, subtle shifts in responsibility, conditional triggers buried under neutral wording, a timeline that did not protect but transferred, not immediately, but inevitably. And his jaw tightened just slightly, enough for the woman seated across from him to notice as she leaned in, asking quietly if there was a problem, her voice controlled but edged with concern, because she had seen that look before, not often, but enough to recognize when something was off. And Daniel did not answer her right away. He scrolled back to the beginning of the section, then forward again, reading it twice, slower the second time, the ticking clock now at 3 minutes, each second pressing harder against the silence that had replaced the earlier confidence. And behind him someone whispered that they were running out of time, that the other party was waiting, that delays would signal uncertainty, and uncertainty could cost them leverage. But Daniel did not move for the pen again, his hand resting flat on the table now, fingers still, as if committing too soon would break something he was still trying to understand. And across the room Maya had not moved either. She stood exactly where she had been, hands relaxed at her sides, not watching the executives, not watching the attorneys, but watching him, because she knew that moment, the exact moment when someone saw it, when the words on a page stopped being background noise and became something else entirely, something dangerous. And she did not need to speak again, because the document was speaking now, louder than any voice in the room. And one of the junior analysts suddenly leaned forward, pointing at his own screen, hesitating before speaking, then finally saying that the liability trigger extended beyond the initial merger window, that it covered any dispute filed within 30 days after closing, and that if the language held as written, their company would absorb all legal and financial consequences regardless of origin. And the words hung there, incomplete, but clear enough, and no one interrupted him this time. Not because they agreed, but because they were no longer certain they could disagree. And Daniel finally looked up again, slower than before, his gaze moving past the table, past the executives, until it landed back on Maya. And there was something different in his expression now, not approval, not yet, but recognition, the kind that came when a system failed to behave the way it was designed to. And he spoke, not loudly, but with enough weight to still the room completely, asking her how she noticed it, not as a challenge, but as a question that mattered. And for the first time since she had entered the room, every person present was no longer looking at her as an interruption, but as the one variable that had changed everything. Maya did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because she chose her words carefully, the way someone does when they know they are standing in a room that was never meant to hear them. Her gaze steady on Daniel as the seconds stretched, the red numbers now dropping under 3 minutes. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, almost quiet, but it carried across the table with a clarity that cut through the tension. Because it is not written to protect you. It is written to confuse you, she said, and a faint shift moved through the room again. A few executives exchanging looks, one of them leaning back as if trying to distance himself from the implication, while the attorney who had dismissed her earlier let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it did not reach his eyes, and he responded quickly, explaining that legal documents were always complex by nature, that misinterpretation was common for those without formal training, and that the clause in question followed industry standards, his words coming faster now, more layered, as if volume could restore authority. But Maya did not look at him. She kept her attention on Daniel, because he was the one deciding whether truth mattered in this room. And she took a small step closer to the table, not crossing any boundary, but enough to place herself within the same light as everyone else. Look at the conditional trigger, she continued, her tone still even. It does not activate immediately, it activates after closing, when the agreement is already binding, and it is tied to external disputes, not internal ones. So anything filed against the merged entity becomes your responsibility, even if it originates from their side. And this time the silence that followed was heavier, not empty, but filled with the sound of people thinking, really thinking, not just reacting. And Daniel's eyes moved again, back to the document, slower now, tracing the structure she described, the delayed trigger, the scope of responsibility, the absence of reciprocal protection, and he felt it settle into place, not as a theory, but as a pattern, and patterns did not lie, not when they aligned this cleanly. And across from him the woman, who had asked earlier, leaned forward again, her voice lower now, asking one of the attorneys to confirm the interpretation. But the attorney did not answer right away, his confidence no longer immediate, his fingers hovering over his tablet, as if the answer might appear if he waited long enough. And the countdown reached 2 minutes, the numbers flashing in sharper intervals, reminding everyone that this moment was supposed to end with a signature, not uncertainty. And yet no one reached for the pen, not anymore, because the certainty they had walked in with had shifted into something else entirely. And Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, not relaxed, but deliberate, creating space between himself and the document, as if seeing it from a different angle might confirm what he was beginning to understand. And then he looked at Maya again, not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as someone who had seen what others had missed, and he asked, more directly this time, "Where did you learn to read contracts like this?" And it was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, one that carried weight, because the answer would not just explain her, it would explain how this had almost been overlooked. And Maya held his gaze without hesitation, the room waiting on her response, the city lights beyond the glass flickering in quiet contrast to the stillness inside. And for a brief moment, everything felt suspended, not by power, not by status, but by a single truth that had not yet been fully acknowledged. And the closer they moved to it, the harder it became to ignore. Maya's answer did not come with pride or hesitation. It came simply, as if it had always been there waiting to be said. "I used to study contract law," she said, her voice steady. and a faint ripple moved across the room again. Not disbelief this time, but recalibration, as if everyone present had to adjust the way they were seeing her in real time. And she continued before anyone could interrupt. I did not finish, but I kept reading. I kept practicing, because once you understand how language works, you start to see what it is trying to hide, and the words settled differently than anything before. Not defensive, not explanatory, just honest. And Daniel watched her closely, not just listening to what she said, but how she said it. The absence of performance, the absence of any attempt to impress, and that absence carried more weight than confidence ever could. And across the table, the attorney who had spoken earlier leaned forward again, his tone sharper now, less patient, as if the room had drifted too far from where it was supposed to be, reminding Daniel that the firm they were negotiating with had a long-standing reputation, that their legal team was among the best in the industry, that clauses like this were standard in high-value mergers, and that overanalyzing language could delay decisions that required decisiveness. His words carefully chosen, but carrying an edge of urgency, because the clock had dropped under 2 minutes, the red digits flashing now with a steady rhythm that echoed against the glass walls. And for a moment, it almost worked, the room leaning slightly back toward its original gravity, toward momentum, toward the expectation that this deal would move forward as planned. But then the junior analyst spoke again, more certain this time, pointing to an additional line buried deeper in the clause, explaining that there was no explicit cap on liability, that the exposure was not limited, that if a dispute escalated beyond projections, the financial impact could extend far beyond the value of the merger itself. And that detail did not just shift the conversation, it changed it entirely, because now this was not about interpretation, it was about risk, and risk was something everyone in the room understood, even if they had not seen it at first. And Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not in panic, but in recognition, the kind that came when a decision that once felt controlled suddenly revealed consequences that could not be contained. And he stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to break the rhythm of the room, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that drew every eye to him. And the attorneys fell silent. The executives stopped shifting. Even the faint hum of the building seemed to recede, and he walked a single step closer to the screen, looking at the clause again, not as a formality, not as a step in the process, but as the center of the decision itself. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried more authority. Why was this not flagged? He asked, not directing the question at anyone specific, but allowing it to land on everyone at once. And no one answered immediately, because the answer did not come easily, not when the room was still catching up to what had just been uncovered. And in that silence, the earlier confidence felt distant, almost misplaced, replaced by something heavier, something that could not be ignored or dismissed. And Daniel turned his head slightly, his gaze returning to Maya, and there was no trace of dismissal left now, only focus, because the decision he was about to make no longer depended on hierarchy or expectation. It depended on whether he was willing to acknowledge what had been placed in front of him. And the clock continued, counting down, 1 minute and 30 seconds, the numbers blinking in steady intervals. But no one moved toward the pen, not anymore, because the outcome that had seemed inevitable at the start of the meeting had dissolved into uncertainty, and the only thing left in its place was the truth that had entered the room quietly and refused to leave. The room did not move forward after his question. It folded inward, quieter than before, as if every person present had stepped back inside their own thoughts at the same time. And Daniel Whitmore remained standing, not rushing, not forcing the next step, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, while the document stayed open in front of him like something unresolved. And for the first time since the meeting began, the urgency of the deal no longer controlled the room. The countdown still blinking in red, now under 1 minute. But its pressure felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to what had surfaced, and no one reached to silence it. No one even acknowledged it out loud, because something more important had taken its place. And in that stillness, the smallest details became louder, the faint hum of the ventilation system, the soft shift of fabric as someone adjusted in their chair, the distant movement of traffic far below the glass walls, all of it filling the silence that no one seemed willing to break. And Maya stood exactly where she had been, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence no longer questioned, but not yet fully understood either. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders steady, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and now it was up to the room to decide what to do with it. And Daniel finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his eyes lowering once more to the claws, not searching anymore, but confirming, tracing the same lines he had already read, the delayed trigger, the open-ended liability, the absence of balance. And this time there was no doubt left in the pattern, only consequence. And across from him one of the senior executives leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to speak, then stopped, choosing silence instead, because there was nothing left to defend without certainty. And the attorney who had argued earlier sat back now, his posture less rigid, his tablet untouched, as if the words on it no longer offered the authority they had just minutes ago. And Daniel straightened slowly, not with tension, but with clarity, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And he reached toward the pen again. But this time he did not pick it up, his fingers hovering for a moment before pulling away, leaving it exactly where it was, untouched. And that small motion carried more weight than any statement could have, because it marked a decision without needing to be spoken. And the countdown slipped under 30 seconds, the numbers flashing faster now, brighter against the glass. But still no one moved to finalize anything, because the direction of the room had already changed. And Daniel turned his head once more toward Maya, his gaze steady, not measuring her anymore, not questioning her place, but acknowledging what she had brought into the room. And he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to close the distance that had existed between them at the start. And then he looked back at the table, at the document, at the deal that had seemed inevitable just minutes ago, and allowed the silence to remain, not as hesitation, but as intention. Because sometimes the strongest decision was the one that refused to be rushed, and in that moment the entire room seemed to understand it, not through words, but through the absence of them, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but full of realization, full of restraint, full of a shift that could not be undone. And as the final seconds counted down, nothing happened. No signature, no confirmation, just the quiet, steady presence of a choice that had already been made without a single word needing to declare it. The silence did not break when the clock reached 0. It deepened, settling into the room like something irreversible. And for a moment no one moved at all, not the executives, not the attorneys, not even the assistants along the wall, because everyone understood what had just happened without needing it to be said. The deal had not been signed. The momentum had been stopped. And the reason for it was no longer hidden in fine print, but standing quietly near the edge of the room. And Daniel Whitmore remained where he was, his gaze still on the document for a final second before he reached forward and closed it. Not abruptly, not with frustration, but with intention, the soft sound of the file clicking shut echoing louder than it should have, marking the end of something that had seemed inevitable just minutes ago. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the room with a calm authority that left no space for argument. "We are not proceeding with this agreement today," he said. And there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a clear decision. And across the table one of the senior executives exhaled slowly. Another leaned back in his chair, as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, while the attorneys exchanged brief, tight glances, already recalculating, already shifting from defense to response. But no one challenged the decision. Not now. Not after what had been uncovered, because the truth had already settled too deeply to be dismissed. And Daniel turned slightly toward the legal team, his eyes sharp again, not uncertain anymore. "I want a full review of every clause in this contract," he continued, his tone precise, line by line, no assumptions, no shortcuts. And the instruction landed with weight, not as a suggestion, but as a reset, a clear boundary drawn where there had been none before. And the attorney who had spoken earlier nodded once, more subdued now, already opening his tablet again, but this time with a different kind of focus, not to confirm what he believed, but to find what he had missed. And Daniel paused for a brief moment before adding, "And I want to know how this passed initial review." And that question carried a different kind of gravity, not directed at a single person, but at the system itself, the process that had allowed something so critical to remain unnoticed until the final minutes, and no one answered immediately, because the answer would take more than a quick explanation. It would require accountability, and the room felt it, even in the quiet. And then Daniel shifted his attention back toward Maya, not as an afterthought, not as a formality, but as a central part of what had just happened. And for a brief second the contrast between them was still there, the tailored suit and the maintenance badge, the power and the position, but it no longer defined the moment the way it had before, because something else had replaced it, something that did not depend on titles or expectations. And he took a single step in her direction, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to acknowledge it. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more direct. "You stop this," he said. And it was not praise, not yet, but recognition, clear and undeniable. And Maya did not react the way the room might have expected. She did not step forward or look away. She simply met his gaze with the same calm she had held from the beginning, as if the outcome had never been about her, only about what was right, and that steadiness stayed with him longer than the words themselves. And around them the room slowly began to move again, chairs shifting, screens dimming, people gathering their notes. But the energy had changed, not hurried, not routine, but reflective, as if everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would not be forgotten easily, not because of the deal that did not happen, but because of how close it had come to happening, and why it had not. And as Daniel turned back toward the table, his hand resting briefly on the closed document, he knew that the outcome of this meeting would extend far beyond this room, far beyond this day. Because decisions like this did not just shape companies. They revealed them. And for the first time since the meeting began, the truth was no longer hidden in the fine print. It was visible, undeniable, and it had changed everything. The room began to empty, not in the usual rush of concluded meetings, but in a slower, more deliberate way, as if each person needed a moment longer than expected to process what had just unfolded. Chairs sliding back with softened movements, screens dimming one by one, conversations kept low and brief, and through it all Maya remained where she had been, not stepping into the center of attention, not drawing eyes to herself, simply waiting until the space around her cleared enough for her to leave without interruption, because that was what she had always done. Finish what needed to be done, then disappear back into the rhythm of the building, unnoticed, unacknowledged. And she turned slightly toward the door, her badge catching a thin line of light as she moved. But before she could take more than a step, Daniel's voice reached her again, not sharp, not commanding, but clear enough to stop her without force. "Maya," he said, and it was the first time her name had been spoken in that room, not read from a badge, not assumed, but recognized. And she paused, turning back slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had expected this moment to come but had not depended on it. And Daniel walked toward her this time, closing the distance fully, no longer separated by the table or the structure of the meeting, and up close the contrast between them was still visible. The precision of his suit, the simplicity of her uniform, but it no longer carried the same meaning it had at the beginning, because something else had taken its place, something that could not be measured by position or expectation. And he stopped a few feet from her, his hands relaxed at his sides, no longer holding authority like a tool, but carrying it with restraint. And for a brief moment he did not speak, as if choosing his words with the same care she had shown earlier. And when he finally did, his voice was quieter than before, but more direct. "Why did you say something?" he asked, and it was not suspicion, not even curiosity in the usual sense. It was a question that reached deeper, asking not about the clause, but about her choice, about the decision to step into a room that had never been hers and risk being dismissed, ignored, or removed. And Maya held his gaze, not searching for approval, not expecting anything in return, and her answer came without hesitation. "Because it was wrong," she said, and the simplicity of it landed with more weight than anything else that had been said. That day, not layered, not strategic, just clear. And Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not visibly to anyone passing by, but enough for him to feel it. The recognition that everything that had just happened had not been driven by ambition or opportunity, but by something far more grounded, something that did not depend on who was watching or what could be gained, and behind them the last of the executives exited the room, their footsteps fading into the hallway, leaving the space quieter, more open, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, not as a gesture of approval, but as acknowledgement, and then he spoke again, this time with intention that extended beyond the moment. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "I want you to sit with the legal team." And there was no hesitation in the offer, no condition attached, just a recognition of value that had already been proven, and Maya did not react immediately, not out of doubt, but because she understood what that meant, the shift it represented. The door had opened, and she gave a small nod in return, not overcommitting, not overstating, just accepting the moment for what it was, and Daniel stepped aside then, allowing her a clear path to the door. Something that would have gone unnoticed before, but now carried a quiet significance. And as she walked out into the hallway, the light there softer, less reflective than the boardroom behind her, her footsteps steady against the polished floor, she did not look back, not because it did not matter, but because she did not need to. The outcome had already spoken for itself. And inside the room, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, looking at the closed document on the table, then at the empty chairs, and finally toward the door she had just passed through. And in that quiet space, without the pressure of the meeting, without the weight of expectation, he understood something that had not been clear before. That power did not always come from position, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room was the one no one expected to hear. The hallway outside the boardroom carried a different kind of silence, softer, stretched across the polished floors and glass walls like a quiet exhale after something that had almost gone wrong, and Maya Carter walked through it without slowing, her steps steady, measured, the same pace she had always kept in this building, past offices where lights were still on, past reflections of herself in glass panels that now seemed to hold a different weight, not because she had changed, but because something in the way the world saw her had shifted, even if only slightly, and she reached the service corridor where the light dimmed, where the air felt cooler, where the noise of the executive floor faded into something more familiar, something grounded, and she paused there for just a second, not to think, not to question, but simply to breathe, the kind of breath that comes after holding steady for longer than anyone realizes. And then she continued forward, disappearing into the rhythm. She knew, the one that did not require recognition to exist. While behind her, 40 floors above the city, Daniel Whitmore stood alone in the boardroom that had emptied too quickly, the chairs now still, the table cleared except for the closed contract resting exactly where it had been left, and he walked back toward it slowly, not with urgency, not with frustration, but with a quiet awareness that something far more important than a deal had just unfolded in that space. And he placed his hand lightly on the document again, not to reopen it, but to acknowledge what it represented, a decision avoided, a consequence prevented, and more than that, a moment that had forced him to see beyond the patterns he had trusted for years. And he looked toward the glass wall, where the city stretched out in layers of light and movement, thousands of lives continuing without pause, unaware of how close one decision had come to shifting everything. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself to step away from the role he carried so naturally, the certainty, the control, the expectation that he would always know, always decide, always lead without hesitation. And instead he stood there in the quiet, recognizing that clarity does not always come from authority, that sometimes it arrives from the edges, from voices that are not expected to speak. And he turned slightly, his gaze falling on the empty space near the door where Maya had stood. And for a moment it felt as if that presence had not fully left the room, not in a physical sense, but in the way it had altered everything around it, the way it had changed the outcome without demanding recognition. And he let that settle, not as a lesson spoken aloud, not as something to be summarized or explained, but as something understood in silence. And outside, the evening light shifted across the glass, casting long reflections that stretched across the floor, touching the edge of the table, the closed contract, the empty chairs, and then fading slowly as the city moved forward. And somewhere beyond that floor, beyond the glass and steel and structured decisions, Maya continued her path without looking back, not because the moment did not matter, but because she did not need it to define her. And in that quiet separation, in those two different directions, something remained between them, not spoken, not formalized, but real, a recognition that had no title, no position, no contract to hold it in place, only the stillness of a moment where truth had been seen clearly, and the kind of silence that followed when nothing else needed to be said.